Hi, welcome to my channel Cloud with Girish. In this video, I'm going to show you how to use custom domain name for your AWS API endpoints. Custom domain name for the API endpoints allow API URL to be more user-friendly and offer many other benefits. By default, AWS generates API endpoints by using REST API, AWS region, and stage name. Here is an example of a URL or a custom API endpoint. We have HTTPS, REST API ID, execute API remains constant, region is the region where API endpoint has been deployed, Amazon AWS.com remain a constant, stage name is the stage for the API deployment. And then there is a API resource path, which in this example, I'm using guest customer info. AWS API Gateway provides a feature to use custom domain name for the API endpoint. By using custom domain name for API endpoint, you can reduce the dependency on AWS specific domain names and use your business and user-friendly custom domain name. For example, if you have an API that returns customer information, your API endpoint with custom domain name may look like https api.yourdomain.com/getCustomerInfo. Not only this provides a way to create more friendly API endpoints, but also abstracts the API generated API endpoint. This provides the flexibility to map a new version of API endpoint without impacting consumers using the API endpoint. It simplifies the process of API versioning and upgrades, and in general, provide greater control over API management. One note I would like to call out that custom domain names are not supported for private APIs. Let's look at our business use case. Our business use case is generate a origin certificate in Cloudflare. Cloudflare in this example is a DNS provider. Hence, I have to generate a certificate in Cloudflare. Import this certificate in AWS using AWS Certificate Manager. Create custom domain name using AWS API Gateway, and then invoke the API using custom domain name. One note here, I'm using Cloudflare, but same use case can also be used with another AWS service, which is Route 53, if you are using Route 53 as your DNS provider. Let's look at the architecture pattern. We have the users, we got API gateway, we have certificate manager, there is a DNS certificate from Cloudflare. I have a Lambda, and then CloudWatch is here for the log purpose. The prereq for this workshop is that you have a registered domain. Of course, the whole point of this workshop is to create a custom domain endpoint for the API. So it's essential that a registered domain is in place. Let's get started. So we'll create a certificate for the domain. We'll import the certificate in AWS using AWS Certificate Manager. We'll create a custom domain name using API Gateway. We'll link this certificate with custom domain name, map the desired API endpoint and stage, and then create a CNAME, invoke the API using custom domain name, and then we'll review the API results. So let's look at the first step here. Create a certificate for your domain. It's a two-step process. You can log into your Cloudflare account and then click on create a SSL TLS certificate in Cloudflare. Then import this certificate in AWS using AWS Certificate Manager. So in order to create certificate for your domain, you need to be logged in and then click on SSL TSL certificate. We'll click on origin server and then we'll simply click on create certificate. Now, one point to note here is that in the host names here, it's a *cloudwithgirish.com and cloudwithgirish.com. That means this certificate is applicable to the domain. By you can add a specific subdomain if you wish to add additional values like api.domain.com or test.api.domain.com, whatever your use case requires. In my case, I'm using asterisk, so I will be able to use api.domain.com here as well. Save the value of this origin cert and private key. We will need the value in the next step for AWS Certificate Manager. Of course, I'm not showing the value here, but when you generate your certificate and private key will look like this. They will have a begin certificate, there will be value, and then there is end certificate. Same thing for the private key. You will have begin private key. In between there will be value for the key and then end private key. We need both the components in the next step for the certificate manager. Once we have the origin certificate, let's log into your AWS account using AWS console. There we will look for certificate manager service. It's important to make sure that you check that you are in the right AWS region. You should select the AWS region where you have API and want to create custom domain name for the API. In this example, my API is deployed in Ohio region, and I'm selecting the AWS Cert Manager in the same region. So once I have that, let's click on request, and then from there we'll import the certificate. We'll input the certificate detail, and in this section, this is where we will use the cert and private key value saved in the previous step. So let's put those value here and then click on next. We can add any tag if you want. I will skip this step and will click on next. Review and import the certificate. So in this step, we're going to review that our public key info and all other information looks correct, and then simply click on next. Next step, let's just review that certificate has been issued. So if it is status is not issued, then you should review that or wait for the status to be issued. Once the status is in the issued status, then we are good for the next step. The next step is that we create a custom domain using the AWS API gateway. So in this, by now we have this certificate imported, so we will create a custom domain for this API. So let's go to API gateway, click on custom domain name. Here I'm gonna use the subdomain as api.cloudwithgirish.com, and I'm gonna just select the recommended TLS 1.2 and click next. In the next step, I'm going to also select the certificate. This was the certificate that we imported in earlier step using AWS Certificate Manager. Once I have selected this ACM certificate, then just simply create domain name. So now you will see that custom domain has been created. Now we need to map, integrate it with our API endpoint. So let's click on API mapping and then configure API mappings. So I'm going to add a new API mapping. So I'm going to select the API. You will see that I need to select the API, I need to select the stage, and then there is an optional path. I'm simply going to select my API, and I'm going to select my stage, which is dev for development. Now API has been mapped with this custom domain name. Last step is to create a CNAME. So we will create a DNS record by adding CNAME in Cloudflare. So let's log in back to the Cloudflare and look for DNS records. We'll click on add records, and here we will add API gateway domain name in the target field. Now, once we have added the CNAME, we are ready to invoke the API using custom domain name. You can invoke the API via a consumer application, via browser, any API tools like Postman. In my example, here I'm using Postman to invoke the API. And if you see for my get method, my endpoint is now api.cloudwithgirish.com, and then my function resource path. And I'm getting the results back from this API. I'm getting the data that I have for my method. Now, in case you get 521 error in this step, then two things to watch for. Make sure that you are using the HTTPS in front of URL. And then second thing is to make sure you check that Cloudflare SSL mode is set to full. Last step, if you want, you can disable the generated API endpoint. Since we have the custom domain for API, we can update the API setting in by going back to our AWS account and the API gateway to disable the default API endpoint. With this step, then you will disable the generated point, of course, and then it can only be accessed through the custom domain name that has been set up for this API endpoint. That is it. With this workshop, a custom domain name has been created for the API endpoint, and API has been invoked using the custom domain name successfully. Now you have a simplified API endpoint using your custom domain name. If need arises, you can update the API endpoint mapping without impacting the API consumer. Hope you have enjoyed this tutorial. I'm working on some other interesting content on various AWS topics. These will be posted soon. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.